Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do Tank, Adelphi Global, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. I'm your host, Alexandra Steinkraus, and in this series you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in a changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow Climate Diplomacy and Security on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. Welcome back to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. As we mark the 25th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, the Women, Peace and Security agenda stands at a critical crossroads. And it's vital that we look at how the agenda responds to emerging challenges such as climate change. While there are implementation challenges with funding shortfalls, limited participation in formal peace negotiations and decision-making roles, as well as protection challenges, there's also been progress. In 2025, the UN Secretary-General's report on WPS highlighted advancements, with over 100 countries developing and launching national action plans on WPS in every region of the world, as well as wider recognition of important cross-cutting issues like intersectionality and climate security within the agenda. But we still need to move from commitments to action and address things like financing and data challenges. So drawing on insights from Asia and the Pacific and beyond, this podcast will explore how the pillars of the WPS agenda, participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery, can address the inseparable challenges of fostering peace and climate resilience. By weaving together regional and global insights, today we will explore how can gender-responsive climate action become a pathway to sustainable peace. We're lucky to be joined by Norul Rashid, team leader and regional policy advisor on governance, peace and security, and Japhet William Graham Eichel, climate, peace and security specialist. And they're both joining us from the UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok. Welcome to the both of you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Great. Very happy that both of you can join in this conversation. So to help set the stage for our conversation today, in many areas around the world, climate impacts are compounding existing grievances and exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, including those linked to gender. Understanding and unpacking this confluence of gender and climate in peace and security has become increasingly important in multiple ways. In climate security analysis, in identifying opportunities and entry points for peace, in fora such as the UNSC and various COPs, and in building resilient and inclusive societies. So, Japhet, can you start us off by briefly outlining how gender norms, roles, and inequalities intersect with climate and security challenges?
Thank you very much, Alex. And first and foremost, wonderful pronunciation of my name. So congratulations on that. And thank you very much.
Deep sigh of relief.
Exactly. And thank you very much for having me. And congratulations for Adelphi for 50 episodes or more than 50 episodes now of this wonderful podcast. I'll just answer you very quickly, and then I actually bounce it back to Norul because maybe she can talk about why she hired me in the first place, looking at climate security in UN Women. But I think my brief answer for now would be that gender, it expands and opens up nuances of peace and security. And me coming from a more conflict and mediation background, including gender, has really widened perspectives for me also, which both goes in the issues of policy and programming, but also in terms of how we perceive peace and security. And with that, actually, what do you have to say about why did you look at climate, peace, security from UN Women's side?
Thank you so much, Alex, and my colleague, Japhet. But thank you so much to Adelphi for this invitation. It is, a big privilege for us UN Women to speak on this issue. And thank you again for the relevant question as well. For UN Women, as the lead entity on gender equality and women's empowerment in the UN system, let me start by explaining why we are examining that intersection between gender, women, peace and security, and climate change. And I'm really speaking based on what we have studied and our programming for the last few years. So As Japhet has mentioned, climate peace and security, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, CPS and sort of WPS, they do considerably expand the concept of security as seen and experienced through the lives of women and girls. And that's really important. So climate peace and security inherently, it makes us ask about what is security? How do you define it? Whose security are we talking about? And who provides that security? So if you look at many of the countries that are on the sort of the global indices, they are peaceful countries, right? But women still face threats to their peace and security. And this has been exacerbated by climate change long before it becomes an issue for men or for their communities. So the WPS agenda, when we look at the WPS agenda, it is an established framework. It's a normative framework that can be transformed and has been transformed into national policies, which underscores the effectiveness of non-securitized responses to climate change, but as well places women's leadership and responses to climate change, right? Their participation and their contributions, that's at the heart of the responses. Just to answer your question, so research and programmatic evidence demonstrate that gender roles, norms, and power dynamics, these are often reinforced by policies and legislation, practices. They do shape how women and men experience, respond to, and contribute to insecurity in a changing climate. In turn, insecurity further weakens these people's ability to respond to and adapt to climate shocks. So women who are often disproportionately represented among the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the population, and some of them are very highly dependent on natural resources too, and very often excluded from decision making. So they are particularly impacted by climate change. And so climate change is not the problem as such, but the systems, the policies, they are the problems. They are the instruments that we need to change. Unfortunately, the narrative in our climate peace and security discourse, as we have seen, is that women are vulnerable, they are victims, they must be protected, rather than to see them as sort of decision makers and solution providers with their own inherent power and agency to contribute to peace and security during the climate crisis. So, Japhet, what do you think? Can you speak a little bit more about the nuances of peace and security?
Yeah, so as Norul was saying, when we work in UN Women on climate, peace and security is actually an issue of putting in women's and girls' perspectives, but also the consequences on their daily security. So if you look at security as a continuum, that's kind of the way I perceive climate, peace, security, on climate as a continuum, peace as a continuum, and security as a continuum. For example, gender-based violence has often been left out from that security continuum. We look at intra-communal tensions, and that's kind of our lowest level of conflict. But then applying the gender lens widens the continuum. Another example is how women and men are impacted differently from intra-communal violence following climate shocks, for example, or also displacement, where women are different risks following displacement than men are. And including these things strengthen both our policy responses, but also our programming. And from a male point of view, I think it's important also to say that what we're looking at is not only from a women's point of view, it's also looking at how the patriarchal structures are actually also harming men and putting them at a disadvantaged position. Because in terms of what we call negative masculine expectations, these are often associated with violence, right? Or revenge and control, which limits how men are able to cope following climate shocks. For long in the climate peace security realm, we've spoken about how men, they are recruited to join groups or organized crime groups. But many of these issues are because that's expected by men to join these groups to regain their masculinity, especially when they lose livelihoods. So it's expanding our understanding of things which are actually already going on. And we see this happening globally from South America to Sahel to Afghanistan and even in the Pacific. And on the other continuum in terms of peace, we see the same nuances. So by including gender and the Women, Peace, Security agenda, as Norul was saying, we look at women's critical contributions to peace building and they become even more apparent. Because often what women do in the communities every day go kind of silently. People don't recognize it or at least don't see it as peace building. But I think for all who've seen what communities do both before, during, and after disasters, women are at the forefront. They stretch dwindling food resources, they walk further for water, And they also become innovative on fuel sources. We've seen that fuel sources such as chopping down wood or firewoods can also lead to conflict. So all these actions actually prevent communal tensions at its instance and happens long before we come in as the international community and start doing peace building. So by including gender, it's also looking at what women are already doing and strengthening in doing so. But I must say that it seems that climate peace security is integrating gender more and more. Just the last 3 years, I've seen there's been a change. The Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs did a quite good study some years ago on how it integrates in peace and security. But also in UNMISS, there was a new mandate in South Sudan where they right now recognize that both climate events and environmental events, they affect men and women differently. And that's completely new language we haven't seen, at least in this space. But that's only down to intense work by colleagues in the UN system, outside the UN system, for example, the Climate Security Mechanism, but also people in UNMISS in South Sudan who work closely with UN women colleagues and gender advisors on this.
Thanks so much to the both of you. This has been really helpful in understanding these foundations that will lay the groundwork for our conversation today. I think you've brought up also really good questions that are the underline of most of these different episodes of what is security, whose security are we concerned with, and who's also providing it. Before we dive deeper in today's conversation, we'd also like to share some remarks from Nafisa Balak, founder of Zamik Balochistan, a community-driven and youth-led movement in Pakistan, on how climate change impacts peace and security within her community.
Hello, my name is Nafisa Baluch. I'm 18-year-old and the founder of Zamik Balochistan, a youth-led organization working on climate education and rehabilitation. I come from Gwadar in Balochistan, where climate justice is not just an environmental issue, but a question of peace and security. Rising temperatures and repeated floods create daily struggles for people, especially women who already live in a marginalized and conflict-affected region. My work matters because it ensures that our voices, which are often left behind, are heard in the global fight for climate justice.
So then, Norul, I'm hoping you can pick up how are these dynamics that you both have outlined taking shape in the Pacific and South Asia? And can you share some more insights on Nafisa and her work?
Oh, thank you so much. And, just listening to Nafisa is a powerful example of why Asia Pacific is such a critical region to understand these climate peace and security and women peace and security linkages. She's only 18, but she already leads an indigenous youth organization in Balochistan, Pakistan, where gender norms and security and climate change collide. Nafisa is leading projects like the Pakistan's first climate school and the first climate camp in Balochistan, which put emphasis on training, resilience building, and sort of just giving a much broader platform to women and communities who are equally affected, but they have less representation in the matter, right? And we had the privilege of having Nafisa join our Youth Climate Action Initiative workshop in Karachi, which was organized by UN Women Country Office some weeks ago. The workshop showed how Asian young leaders like Nafisa co-design gender transformative and peace positive solutions to climate-related solutions. So just to respond to the sort of the regional dynamics, everyone knows by now that Asia Pacific is a region marked by extremes. Some countries live fairly peacefully, some are in more fragile situation, others face ongoing crisis, and some enjoy really decades of stability. But Asia Pacific is among the world's most climate vulnerable regions. Asia, for example, is a continent where warming is, twice as fast as the global average because of the large land mass that it possesses. Half of the Pacific's population, for example, they live within 10 kilometers of the coast, making them pretty vulnerable to saltwater intrusion and contamination. Now, the World Bank has estimated that without mitigation efforts, 49 million people in East Asia and the Pacific will be forced to flee their home due to climate impacts by 2050. And so you have all this really critical data and consequences as a result of climate change. Now, in this region, governments are increasingly convinced to develop what we call comprehensive or impactful WPS national action plans that very often do reflect emerging issues such as climate change. UN Women has been encouraging governments to take these plans very seriously. as a strategic blueprint for their own conflict prevention and peace building strategies. So we have around 14 national action plans and a regional plan of action for ASEAN. Only about 4 effectively reference climate change with some actions. And this is really partly due to a lack of understanding of the nexus between climate change and women, peace and security, also lack of knowledge and capacities and resources to undertake a proper analysis before they develop the national action plans. And that is why we launched some weeks ago a guidance note specifically to provide guidance to member states. And this was done in partnership with Australia on how to integrate climate, peace and security into national action plans on the years, so that climate-related security risk for women are correctly analyzed and included, and so that governments will know how to work better with women leaders and organizations to keep the peace despite climate stresses. I just want to say that, I traveled to Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, for example, and you have excellent women leaders and women's organizations that are taking local, they're making their own local solution to address rising seawater, for example. Now, these women will never have a space at the policy-making, decision-making table in capitals. They don't have a PhD in environment. They're not climate scientists, but they have valuable contributions to climate change responses and solutions, and they need to be included. And I think this is sort of where UN Women is really trying to make sure that these women's contributions are spotlighted and amplified, right? Also across the region, we have this, what we call the patriarchal social norms, right? We hear a lot about this in the Asia Pacific region, and they're fairly strong and they're quite restrictive, even where women are recognized to play critical roles in food security, in conflict resolution, in disaster recovery. These structures will very often limit their access to decision-making and resources. So from strong Pacific civil society leaders in the Pacific region to women peace builders in South and Southeast Asia, there's a very deep reservoir of knowledge and resources that member states would need to tap on. And they haven't done so, I think, adequately.
Thanks very much. What I'm hearing from you is, of course, there's this very large wealth of knowledge and insights and work taking place at the local grassroots level, but there's still many of these barriers to meaningful participation when it comes to decision making and activities going on in capitals. Hopefully, then throughout the course of our conversation, we'll also be able to shed light on some of these advancements and hopefully some potential solutions and how to better increase this meaningful participation. And as we continue our conversation on how gender and climate peace and security are interlinked, we'll continue to use these 4 pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda: participation, which we've already touched a bit on, these barriers that still exist, protection, prevention, and then relief and recovery, to think about and also conceptualize these interlinkages between gender, climate, peace, and security. Now, you've already talked a bit about some case studies in Papua New Guinea and your experiences there, but do you have any additional examples of how UN Women's work and where leadership has addressed these climate-related security risks and also improved natural resource management?
So I can jump in here because Norul and I just came back from a couple of weeks in the Pacific, and I'm very surprised Norul still wants to talk to me after a couple of weeks with me, where we had a newfound love for Norul and a new love of taro chips in the Pacific, but also where we met strong, very, very strong women leaders in civil society and government, both young and younger. And I think that really inspired what's already going on in the Pacific. Of course, UN Women are doing things throughout the world, and especially also with our colleagues with the Women Humanitarian and Peace Fund. So first and foremost, I would like to say that what we do in UN Women as the first step in climate peace security is, of course, ground everything in analysis. And therefore, we strive to do assessments or get some sort of a contextual understanding of the context, both because climate change is so contextual, but as Norul was saying, also gender, because it runs through these very distinct cultural and social dimensions and channels. So, for example, this is where I want to do a shout out to you, Alex and Adelphi, for the work you helped us do in Sri Lanka on the gender study there on climate peace security. And that really has inspired us to continue that work, looking at the analysis basis. But in Afghanistan, let's start off in Afghanistan, where there was just this cut of the internet and where information is key, knowing what's actually going on, despite women facing unprecedented exclusion in all areas of life. So there we've seen through initial results that the women, despite hardship on multiple fronts, they still collect water, they secure food security for their families. And for example, following a disaster in Herat, women insisted on the first thing being rebuilt were clay ovens. And why, you might ask, is because they knew that clay ovens were crucial for obtaining food security. And they knew that food security was the first point of contention within these communities. So they knew if, tension shouldn't arise in the community, we need to get these clay ovens rebuilt. Other examples from Afghanistan is that, as we've seen in other contexts, the women during natural disasters, they've noticed how deforestation and migration are triggering social stress, tension and violence, which really rip communities apart. And women, despite this, they expose themselves to violence as they walk further and further for water. So I think the Afghanistan case shows us that slowly we're getting to understand what's going on, and from there we can build more programming and policy. In the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in the Philippines, women and men are still navigating a very fragile peace agreement after decades of conflict. And they're still trying to find their place in this new political landscape. So the region has a national action plan on WPS, as the rule says, and UN Women has actually used this to work with former female combatants, helping them to channel the skills that they once used in war into community leadership. And the result has actually been quite powerful, because these women who once carried weapons, they're now carrying responsibilities for peace. And slowly we're trying to find out ways how that can also be translated into environmental protection. So actually these same hands which held conflict are now used to build resilience in the Bangsamoro region. Going back to the Pacific, in the Solomon Islands, where conflict are often flared around land, logging and scarce livelihoods, issues which only climate change make worse, the Peacebuilding Fund, or PBF, UN Women and UNDP, they trained women to sit at the same table as chiefs and councils to really mediate disputes and speak up about land governance. And it really shows that in the Pacific, for example, there are two sets of decision-making mechanisms, so to say. There's the customary one, and then there's the more formal one. So you need to engage both of them, and that's what we're trying to do in the Solomon Islands. But the result from this case was that many women actually for the first time had their voice being heard. And then what emerged was clear, namely that when women took part, disputes, they cooled faster, and also arguments, they held longer and upkeeping peace. Another example from the Pacific was from the Fiji and then again Solomon Islands, where following cyclones, women couldn't leave the marketplaces in larger urban areas. So UN Women actually helped by establishing shelters next to these markets, spaces for them to stay so they wouldn't expose to danger, actually sleeping on the floors and streets close to these markets. So what began as a humanitarian fix through these shelters fairly quickly actually transformed into something unexpected, because these shelters were used for women's meetings because they had the capacity to have a lot of women. But also they were used to resolve disputes at these markets because women were able to gather around the same roof. So it actually shows that the turning a place of commerce into almost a community peace hub. I would also like to shout out, as I said, our colleagues from the WPHF, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, who do work across the world, and UN Women, they support them in these efforts. So in Uganda, for example, they've established women-led peace hubs and peace committees, where they train women both in conflict mediation and climate resilient livelihoods. And the impact has been tangible because more than 100 land disputes have already been resolved. And women are now not only seen as farmers or caregivers, but actually central actors in peace and resilience. I know a couple of weeks ago you had Hisham Al-Omeini on the show.
Hisham Al-Omeini, one of our Weathering Risk Peace Pillar partners. Yeah.
And I must say I was very inspired by the Yemen piece, and it reminded me of a story or a project I kept hearing about, which is a couple of years ago. It was a FAO project also with the PBF. And although UN Women weren't involved directly, I think it's a good case to kind of show how environmental peace building and gender equality can go hand in hand. But shortly, it was about women solving a conflict over water in this very tribal, rural area in Yemen. And women actually went over to both manage the disputes, but also manage the water resources. But three main things came out for this project, which helps me guide climate peace security and women peace security projects to this day. And I think the first one is that local ownership matters, despite what context you're looking at. And that includes letting women themselves find entry points which they find valuable. And that's what Norul also was saying, that gender is so much linked to culture and society. The second one is reminding the community of women's importance through history, that gender inclusion is not a new thing that has happened throughout history, but some communities have just forgotten about it. So the Yemen case, for example, they kept going back to the story of a woman called Saida, who resolved the conflict in 1812, and a proverb actually came out. And then reminding the community, hey, if Saida could do it almost 200 years ago, we can do it today. And then the third one is that knowledge is not just information, it's voice and legitimacy. And that's what we try to do in UN Women, also giving women information, knowledge, so they can continue their work. So it's maybe also a recommendation to donors and partners alike that these things take time. I mean, they don't take 2 years of funding cycle. They take 5, 6, 7 years, because it's transformational change. It's gender structures we need to be broken down from within. So these examples just feature as things where UN Women and their partners have done different things across the world. And a new frontier I think we're looking into is, for example, from Colombia, where environmental defenders who are also women are increasingly being targeted. So also raising their voices in both natural resource management, but also communal peace and security. And I'll excuse the listeners for my bad Spanish, but there's a very important project there which UN Women is also leading, called Mujeres Cambiando su Mundo. So people can also look that up if they want to have a look at that. Yeah. So across the board, I think from north to south, to east to west, this was a fairly quick mental world tour of UN Women and gender work. Yeah.
Thanks very much. This was really helpful to contextualize a lot of these different dynamics. And it also reminds me of an example from our Sri Lanka work that you've mentioned. Actually, at the time of recording, I think the report was just published yesterday, but as part of a joint initiative supported by UNDP and DPPA Joint Program and UN Women, Adelphi conducted the first gender-responsive climate security assessment for Sri Lanka, as well as the Asia-Pacific region, which, in addition to the Spanish resource that you just mentioned, will also link this report in the description for any listeners who want to do more of a deep dive. But one of the things that came up in the research was, of course, how the impacts of drought, similar to some of the dynamics you mentioned in Afghanistan, are particularly severe for women who are often bearing the dual burden of managing household water needs and contributing to agricultural labor. And in Mona Regala, one of the field research locations, women farmers were reporting walking longer distances to fetch water during dry spells, and this reduced their time for income generating activities and exposed them also to some physical risks that I think often go undermentioned, like wildlife encounters as well as gender-based violence. So now we've continued the tour to Sri Lanka very shortly, and we've already dove into protection, I think, quite a bit. And you've mentioned how these climate stressors like extreme weather, resource scarcity can exacerbate gender-based violence and other forms of insecurity for women and marginalized groups. And maybe you can just expand on how some of these risks are exacerbated. And it would also be great if you have additional insights into what protection mechanisms are proving most effective to combat some of these risks.
The first thing to note on gender-based violence and the protection pillar, which you were saying, Alex, is that so-called maladaptation, and something Norul and I have discussed in great detail, namely that climate change does not cause gender-based violence, people do. And I think that's the most important thing to say, that gender-based violence happens not because of climate change, but it may exacerbate it. So therefore, perpetrators of gender-based violence, for example, should not be left the hook or excused by climate change. But that being said, we have seen some correlation between climate stresses and higher rates of gender-based violence. And of course, it's very contextual. So research, including a very good report, maybe you can also link that, Alex, which UN Women colleagues did on gender-based violence following natural disasters in Pacific, where they looked at big data traffic following natural disasters. And what that showed is that women were actually searching keywords related to gender-based violence following natural disasters. And then they correlated that and triangulated that to other findings. So that showed that, especially in the Pacific, that was the case. Another example I can draw out is, so the climate security mechanism, as your listeners may know, do have a climate peace security advisor in UNOWAS, and she was traveling to Cote d'Ivoire, and anecdotally, her analysis also showed that there was a link between resource scarcity in fisherfolk communities and then a rise in domestic violence. Why and how gender-based violence rises, as I said, it really much depends on the context. But what is certain is that these disasters may not only exacerbate it, but it also disrupts essential services and support networks, leaving these women more exposed. And that's also a huge component of the protection pillar, looking at what resources women do have. There was a UN Spotlight report, which is also quite interesting, on climate change and gender-based violence, which actually concluded that for every 1% increase in global temperatures, it will be associated with a 4.7% increase in intimate partner violence. So of course, there's a lot of numbers throwing out there, but it just shows that data backs it up, some of these anecdotal things that we hear. And you may ask, why is this the case about gender-based violence and natural disasters? And what we've heard, at least a little aspect of it, is that women as primary food providers, they often face intimate partner violence or community blame when they cannot secure food, even when shortages are clearly climate driven. So it's kind of a response from communities or partners of saying, why is this resource not available to me? And then putting the blame on women disproportionately and totally not accurate in terms of climate change and its impacts. Another aspect of GBV or gender-based violence is displacement, right? I spoke about it earlier, that when women are in unsafe evacuation centers or temporary shelters, but also urban streets, they are more exposed to gender-based violence and harassment. And in some contexts, we've also seen that child marriage goes up as a negative coping capacity following natural disasters or climate stresses, as families, especially, they are faced with economic stress, treating these as survival coping mechanisms. And then of some of the more other violent connections with GBV, we could mention sorcery and witchcraft, which we just came from the Pacific, which is a very specific case to the Pacific. But I've also heard cases in East Africa, but where sorcery and witchcraft accusations are another form of violence, because women are scapegoated for crop failure, for example, or disasters. And then sometimes it leads to deadly retribution or displacement. So again, it's very contextual and runs through cultural dimensions. But Norul, maybe can you talk about the protection mechanisms which are in place to mitigate some of these things?
Thank you. So I'm just going to build on what Japhet has articulated. So the first one is really about building the knowledge, right? So we need to have that knowledge base. This is a pretty technical area of work. And many of our partners, our women's civil society partners, but also government partners, they want a lot of training on this. And this is really to enable sort of policy making, but also to enable women's organization and women leaders to engage in policy discussions. So we do include, as part of our initiatives and capacity building, particularly on women, peace and security, we always include a session on the nexus, the CPS, the climate, peace and security, and women, peace and security nexus. And increasingly, you are seeing climate change being discussed in many women, peace and security, international, global, regional convenings as well. The Secretary General's annual report on women, peace and security has started to reflect a section on climate, peace and security. And that's really useful for the UN Security Council, for the broader diplomatic and development community to understand the linkages to help them to make decisions as well in capital. The second one is the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans I referred to. These are what we said, comprehensive, inclusive, strategic blueprints that embodies this whole of society approach. And you can look at some of the national action plans, such as Finland, Uganda, the Philippines. They have comprehensively set out the nexus and the role of women and government in understanding the nexus better. So Japhet has referred to gender-based violence as a risk. So embedding climate, peace and security perspectives into gender-based violence systems, right? Looking at the climate stressors that Japhet has referred to with violence risks to improve referral pathways, for example, survival services before, during, and after disaster. So there has to be a way to understand how to include climate, peace and security into these systems. Training women peace builders, particularly in relocation contexts, right? They can mediate between host and newcomer women in places that Japhet has mentioned, like market stores, garden plots, fisheries, and water points. So these are everyday sites where tensions do arise in South Asia, but also in the Pacific as well. And we've also talked about addressing masculinities in transition by engaging men and boys to reframe sort of their roles away from violence and more towards caregiving, gender equality, and resilience. And we do a lot of this work as well at UN Women, where we work with partners such as churches, so that they can sort of jointly look at dialogue programs to re-examine gender roles in changing climates as well. So all this would mean that you really need to look at a new skill set for almost everybody, right? Practitioners, for government, women leaders, women civil society organizations, parliamentarians. It would also mean that government sectors can no longer work in isolation, but they should be convened to examine their policies and programs in a more integrated manner, integrating gender, climate, environment, and security. You're bringing in more actors than ever. And this will require a more comprehensive sort of understanding, but also new skill set. And the Women, Peace and Security agenda, in the trainings that we do convene all these different actors together to understand emerging issues such as climate, peace, and security.
Now, coming to our third pillar, we've already talked a little bit about maladaptation, and not only climate action can have the power to strengthen gender equality and also promote the role of women in society, but if not designed correctly, maladaptation can also lead towards furthering some of these social fault lines. So when it comes to prevention, how can climate action be designed to prevent the deepening of some of these pre-existing social fault lines and inequalities?
Maybe I can jump in here a bit and give you a couple of sound bites on that. I think the first one is that, again, fresh from the Pacific, climate action can be used as a way to redesign mediation. And what we mean with that is that, especially as both of these customary and formal mechanisms, which I spoke about before, they may not be equipped to manage both the growing number of conflicts which happen in these communities, but also the complexity. So really looking at how can we redesign a mediation where climate action features as an integral part, but then where women also have a part in this. So that could be integrating women as mediators in these mechanisms, which not only strengthens the legitimacy, but we could also shift these mediations towards issues like food distribution or water or land use, where women already hold authority. So it's kind of using climate change as a way of redesigning what some communities have done for hundreds of years. Second one goes back to what Norul was saying about migration and how people, they arrive, or newcomers, is that migration and urbanization is often seen as a risk, but you can also see it as an opening for peace positive action. Especially because arrival in new communities is a moment of tension. Who is this? Can we trust them? What should we do with them? But also an opportunity for bridge building and designing new norms. And that includes climate action, because if newcomers come and host communities come, how do they go about climate action in this community? So, women communities in both host and newcomer communities can co-design access norms for gardens, markets, and water, but also how to do climate finance work in these new environments. And then the third point is maybe more on a nerdy side, but I think as equally important, is looking at women as knowledge holders and data collectors. Because as the old saying goes, knowledge is power. And that's also what we saw from the Yemen example, for example. And climate action and finance is often heavily linked to knowledge. It requires big sums of data, of pre-existing assessment, and then making women part of that also widens their decision-making space and their say. So, designing action without disaggregated data risks, continue ignoring women's coping capacities and strategies, just doesn't work anymore. So we need to look at that in a new way. So climate action could help break entrenched gender roles and norms by integrating women as frontline data collectors in adaptation planning in a totally new way. So that could be not only filling the evidence gap, but also strengthening the women's legitimacy in governance aspects and spaces linked to knowledge.
I'm very glad that you were the one to get a bit nerdy at the end of this podcast episode. I'm usually the one who always has something methodology to say, so very glad it was someone else for a change. But now, looking ahead before we really wrap things up, I'd be curious, also from your perspective, Japhet, what innovative strategies are emerging to link climate adaptation with post-conflict recovery and peace building, and also ensuring that women civil society organizations are at the heart of these relief and recovery mechanisms?
So the first one, I think I'll do this in headlines. So the first one is civilian military collaboration, looking at that from UN Women. How do women CSOs and their existing work before, during, and after disasters, how can we make sure that is at least coordinated with response agencies of the defense sector, for example? So I think that's the first innovative step that we at UN Women are looking at expanding. The second one is using women peace security to do climate peace security work. And me being a practitioner of climate peace security before, I've really utilized women peace security's 4 pillars when I go from analysis to action. So yes, I have this analysis. How does it look on the ground in terms of prevention, protection, participation, and relief and recovery? So it's a kind of a linking analysis to action. And also because the women peace security agenda really emphasizes a non-militarized approach, which time and time again, we hear these threats or worries about climate peace security being securitized. So women peace security could really be a way of doing that. And then thirdly, we could use local knowledge, but not only local knowledge, but also local traditions through both climate adaptation and peace building. Because in the Pacific, for example, we look at women as storytellers and looking at how can their oral traditions be used, creating cohesion in different communities and also expanding knowledge on climate data, for example. And then lastly, and maybe that's a segue to Norul, digital peace building. It sounds sexy, and that's actually also what we wanted to be, do new ways of looking at peace building, because the digital space is increasingly linked to climate disinformation, to women being excluded from political participation. So looking at digital peace builders and looking at how that could link to climate peace security.
Thanks very much. So then to really wrap things up, I don't want to be too cheesy at the end, but obviously we've talked a lot about existing challenges that are still ongoing, but also a lot of opportunities, especially at this WPS-CPS nexus. So Norul, what gives you hope for the next 25 years of the Women, Peace and Security agenda? And what next steps or innovations do you believe are really needed to ensure that women and marginalized groups lead the way in terms of building peace, climate resilient societies for generations to come?
Thank you so much. I just want to conclude on a really positive note, because we do see
Amazing.
Right. I mean, we do see women coming up in many of these discussion spaces, and they are coming together with governments. They are being convened more and more to have these discussions, very difficult discussions with government, or particularly around climate peace and security, but also around peace and security issues in general. So these are the women that are really giving us hope. We work, this is our main constituent, the women's organization, women leaders, and they are actively seeking to have a space, in this very complex sort of decision-making spaces. So to conclude, I think 1325, celebrating 1325 this year, it should provide a momentum to all member states, right? We have 140 national action plans globally around the world. About 40% of them do address climate peace and security, and that's very encouraging as well. But we need to do a lot more to ensure that member states are on board and they understand the nexus and these issues as well. I want to speak a little bit about women from the most marginalized and excluded groups. They are more organized. Organizations representing people with disabilities, for example, they are definitely more organized and they're more out there, and they do speak to policymakers and governments. We do help to convene them in our work. So we see them to be more active than before, because we do know that persons with disabilities are often not included in climate-related discussion or decision-making, especially women with disabilities. And that has to change, and government understand why they need to change it. We also reach new audiences across generations, right? We already see young leaders like Nafisa. There's so many more out there around the world. They're holding families together. They're sustaining communities. They're taking the first steps of peace building, even when they are excluded from sort of more formal decision making. And so they are really the proof that resilience are being built every day from the ground up. So imagine if you give them the space, the tools, the support, the resources, the financing, what can they do? I think they can do so much more. So as for next steps, I just want to amplify the recommendations made by civil society at the recent Women, Peace and Security convening in Brisbane. It's about 4, the very critical recommendation. The first is really to increase investment and resourcing for women-led gender and climate justice initiatives. And that includes strengthening data collection and amplifying evidence, but also storytelling of successful case studies. By 2026, government should start reviewing the WPS national action plans to integrate climate, peace, and security across the 4 pillars of the WPS agenda. And also by 2026, identify a regional climate peace and security network linking women peace builders and climate activists to promote collective prevention strategy and shared experiences of rapid response to threats and advocacy. And lastly, you have the COP31 agenda that's coming up. So we must make sure that gender expertise is included in the negotiation rounds and that the agenda focus is on gender climate justice and security nexus as well. So you know what? Women are leading the way. At UN Women, we see the climate crisis as an opportunity to normalize women's leadership in crisis and to change systems that have for far too long functioned ineffectively without half of their populations. Thank you very much, Alex, for giving us this opportunity to speak on this topic. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you so much to the both of you for joining for this episode. I think for those who want to learn more, we'll link all the resources that we've mentioned in the description of this episode, as well as this episode will come out the week of the Berlin Climate Security Conference, which we are also lucky to have a spotlight session on women, peace, and security that will be moderated by Japhet himself. So for those...
Yes.
For our early listeners, when the podcast episodes drop, make sure this upcoming Thursday you're tuning in to the live stream for BCSC and you join for the spotlight session, especially those who like the visual aid along with their information. But thanks once again. This has been a really great conversation and it's definitely leaving me with a bit of inspiration and hope going into the rest of the day. So
thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you very much.
This was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We'll be back with another episode in a few weeks. You can follow our latest updates on Blue Sky and LinkedIn. You can follow us at Climate Diplomacy and Security is the title of our pages. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, goodbye.